Dr. Thomas Hoerr. Thank you so much for joining me.
It's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Yeah, it's a pleasure having you. What are the different kinds of intelligences? Can you talk to me about those different kinds of, because I think a lot of people, they hear intelligence and they just kind of think, well, everyone knows what that is, but you're telling me there are different kinds of intelligence.
Right. I mean, for many, many years, and so in fact, the 1980s, when people thought about intelligence, and they really didn't think about it much at all. You were smart, he wasn't smart. They didn't give it a lot of attention. But until the 80s, we operated under a very narrow, monolithic view of intelligence. And that's because there were intelligence tests invented in the early 1900s, paper pencil tests. And basically, what that meant was that if you did well on a paper and pencil test, we thought you were really intelligent. If you didn't, well, sorry, that's your problem. And the data on those paper and pencil tests became norm, so that 100 meant that you were where you should be given your age, you were in the middle. And if you did much better, 115, that was great. 130 or more, you might be gifted. 136, I think it is, 2 standard deviations. And if you were much lower, then you had a problem. So that was the operating assumption for schools. And for a long time, that was the pathway to success, because doing well on that test enabled you to get into a certain curriculum, a certain kind of track. And I'm saying that test, the reality is that, as you remember, as most of your listeners will remember, once we were in school, those were the kind of tests that were typically relied upon. And I get that. I'm a former educator. I led schools. I'm now teaching at the University of Missouri St. Louis. I'm working in the principal preparation program. And the reality is, while everybody would question, I shouldn't say everybody, while many people would question the validity of that kind of testing all along, we used it because it was easy, it was highly reliable. And there's a lot to be said for ease. And what happened is that then schools began to perpetuate that. So kids who did well on a standardized IQ test did well in school. Well, that's not surprising, because school was promoting, advocating, using the same kinds of experiences. Again, that's the way the world was generally viewed until the early 80s. Now, having said that, if you talk to people back then, if we could get in a time capsule, almost everybody would know someone who didn't do well in school, but gosh, they were successful in life. Why was that? Well, we really didn't give it much thought. They were an aberration. In 1983, however, Howard Gardner, who is a Harvard professor, wrote a book called Frames of Mind, The Theory of Multiple Intelligences. And what Howard did is he began looking at what is intelligence, and he came to the conclusion that intelligence is problem-solving ability. Now, hard to argue with that, but what Howard did was then say, and problems aren't only those on a piece of paper. I, Tom Hoerr, went to school like everybody else who was an educator, and I learned the definition that intelligence is problem-solving ability, but that problem-solving can be much wider. Gardner looked at intelligence, what's considered smart in lots of different societies. He had work that he was doing at a Boston Veterans Hospital. And what he noticed is that depending upon where a brain might be damaged, people lost different functions. There were folks who, because of a brain injury, a stroke, could no longer talk, but they could do great art. There were people, in fact, who couldn't move much physically, but they could sing. There were people who could do lots of small motor, but they couldn't listen to music well. And that began him with the quest of what are intelligences, what does it look like? So the book Frames of Mind had a number of criteria for what is an intelligence. It's a theory, not a research theory. He didn't put people in a tank and measure them. He did it by looking around and seeing what the evidence says. So he looked certainly at the issue of, can intelligence be localized within the brain? And you identify a place within the brain where if an injury occurs, this function is lost.
Mm-hmm.
He looked at, in fact, performance on tests. He also looked at who does well in the world. What are the kinds of problems are there to be solved? So he came up initially with what he called a theory of multiple intelligences, 7 different intelligences. And I'm going to just name them and then I'll talk about them a bit. Linguistic, logical, mathematical. Tom Hoerr, and I've written about MI. My school was an MI school, the New City School in St. Louis, Missouri. We implemented MI in the late 80s for 30 years. Linguistic and logical mathematical, I call the scholastic intelligences. I begin with those because those are the ones that come to mind. And if you do well on the scholastic intelligences, that's your strength. What that means is you're going to do well in school. You might wind up being an attorney, perhaps a physician, because those paths are pretty narrow and they only allow people to walk along them who have those intelligences. If you're strong in the scholastic intelligences, you do well in school. But in addition to linguistic and logical mathematical, Gardner identified spatial, musical, bodily kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and then later the naturalist. Now, let me talk about those. And when we talk about intelligences, I just named Gardner's 8, the multiple intelligence theory. The reality is, while those are the 8 intelligences, there are nuances within each one of them. So let's start with the linguistic. Somebody who is strong linguistic is a good reader or writer. However, it perhaps means they're a good poet. Maybe it means that they read comprehension well, but they don't particularly write well. Lots of nuances there. Somebody who is strong linguistically could be a teacher. It could be somebody who writes for a living, a journalist, a novelist, or it could be somebody who works in another field and loves to read, reads 2 or 3 books a week. That's a strong linguistic intelligence. The logical mathematical intelligence is really the science, the kind of number person. And it's not just somebody who can do good mathematic computation. It's probably somebody who can take a Rubik's Cube and turn it and get a solution. And let me jump a bit ahead here to another question you may have, and I'll come back to this. The intelligences don't work in isolation. There's very little that you can do that will only require one intelligence. So I just mentioned the Rubik's Cube. A better one may be chess. We often think that people who play chess well, good chess players, they're really good logically, mathematically. Well, they are, but also they are probably really good spatially. They can look at a board, they can envision configuration, they can see how things move. So most complex tasks require more than one intelligence. Right. So if you're strong logically, mathematically, you could be a teacher, maybe you're a science teacher, a math teacher, you could be a scientist, you could be an engineer. Lots of jobs require that intelligence. Spatial intelligence is next. That is, I used to call it the art intelligence, but it's far more than that. Spatial is somebody who can solve problems visually. And again, when we think about multiple intelligences, part of being smart is knowing what intelligence is best for solving a problem and using it if you have it. So if I said to you, Jackson, here's an easel and some art, what I want you to do is paint something that really captures sadness. Mm-hmm. Now, if you're not strong spatial, you're going to look at me and sit there and look at the easel for 20 minutes. If you're strong spatially, probably before I finish, you begin to pick it up and draw something. The classic example of this that I use personally is the Vietnam Memorial in Washington, D.C. Maya Lin entered a competition of architects, and the question was, how can we honor these people who died in Vietnam? And what she created was the wall. Everybody, even today, when people go there, it's remarkably solemn, it's meaningful. That's the spatial intelligence. She conceptualized it and visualized it using that spatial intelligence. So if you have spatial intelligence, you might be an artist, you might be an architect, you might be some kind of an engineer who does that a great deal. one of the ways when we were talking about MI years ago that we used to try to figure out what intelligence was someone's strength. So I'd say to you, Jackson, I'm coming to your town. I'm flying into the airport. Here's a piece of paper. Tell me how to get from the airport to your house. Now, this is before GPS, of course. Well, some people would write down number one, take terminal A, da, da, da. They'd write a list. That's a linguistic person. Some other people, however, would do a drawing. That's a spatial person. Somebody else might actually give you a piece of paper that was heavily laden in numbers, not just turn right at Smith Street, but drive 6 blocks and turn right. And
Hmm.
what that's allowing people to do is use their strongest intelligence in solving a problem. So we've talked about linguistic, logical, mathematical, and spatial. Musical comes next in my mind, and that's something we see and we feel. Somebody with a musical intelligence obviously can express themselves musically in a powerful way. Somebody with a strong musical intelligence may be able to perform. It may be simply that, and I don't mean to say simply to demean it, but it may be there's someone who knows how to use music to soothe themselves. Somebody who's had a tough day, difficult experience, and come home and know exactly what kind of music to put on the headphones so that they can relax. That's the
Hmm.
musical intelligence. In a subsequent book, Gardner wrote about the progression of skills, if you will, and I think it works particularly well in using the musical to explain it. And he talked about there are several levels within each intelligence: appreciate, perform, and create. And for me, Tom Hoerr said not musical. The musical makes the most sense. If you're low in the musical intelligence, you can still appreciate. You can put on those headphones, you can go to the symphony, you can simply enjoy, and that's wonderful. A level up, though, is somebody who can actually perform, whether they play in a band in the garage or they play in the symphony, they were the high school band or whatever. They can actually produce music and derive satisfaction and entertain others. That's a smaller group than the appreciate. Perform gets a bit smaller. And then at the pinnacle, you've got create. And those are the people who can actually create in music, whether they do that enough to make a living, whether they do it enough just for themselves. But that's a good example of progression within intelligences. So we've talked about linguistic, logical, mathematical, spatial, physical, finally kinesthetic. So when I talk about next, that's pretty obvious if you've been watching the NBA finals, you've been watching hockey finals, that's bodily kinesthetic intelligence. But
Hmm.
bodily kinesthetic intelligence is also a juggler. It's also a surgeon who can go in and do remarkably minute actions and save a patient's life. That's a bodily kinesthetic intelligence. The
Yeah.
last two of the initial 7 were the personal intelligences, and Gardner actually lumped those together in a chapter: interpersonal and intrapersonal. Interpersonal is not what the name implies, because when people hear interpersonal, they typically think of the cheerleader. Oh, Jackson, you're really interpersonal. You're going to be the life of the party. Come have dinner with me. That may be interpersonal, but that's not the real definition. Someone who is strong interpersonally is very good at reading other people. They're good at walking in a room, understanding, picking up nuances. If you are a successful salesperson, you're probably strong interpersonally. A classic example of somebody who wasn't strong interpersonally, and your female viewers will know right where I'm headed on this. Years ago, when I was working at New City School, I had a woman who was the chair of my board of trustees, very smart, dynamic woman, and we had a breakfast meeting. And she came in for the breakfast meeting, and I said, "Hey, how are you doing?" And she said, "Well, I'm still grumpy from last night." And I said, "What happened last night?" He said, "Well, my car died. I knew I needed a new car. So my husband and I went car shopping, and we went to 4 dealerships." And I'm pausing so the women who are listening, they know. She said, "We went to 4 dealerships. Salesperson came up to us, and I said, I need a new car. And each time they talked to my husband. Each time they looked at him, they talked to him. Now, these people were sales folks, but they clearly did not have a strong interpersonal intelligence. Of course, they did
Mm-hmm.
make sales. So, strong interpersonal intelligence, I would argue, is really, really important in today's world, probably in all worlds, because it allows you to understand other people and it allows you to work with them. Chances are, if you think of anybody who's successful in the world, however you want to define that success, and I'm not suggesting just dollars and cents, they're strong interpersonally because they can work with other people. Yesterday, I was at a panel in the university and we were talking about how you can help people become committed to the university, how you can raise money. And one of the things about which I talked was the need to listen to other people. And what happens, I don't know you, Jackson, but I know you well enough already to know you're filled with ideas. You've got lots of opinions and lots of experiences. I do too. Most people do. And what happens is when we meet somebody, human nature is we say, hi, how are you? And we want to tell them our story.
Mm-hmm.
But being interpersonal means you need to take a deep breath and stop and listen and really understand. Not just listen to what they're saying. Look at how their eyes are moving, look at their body language. There's a wonderful book by David Brooks, who's a New York Times columnist, came out in maybe 3 or 4 years ago, called How to Know a Person. And Brooks made the case that I'm making right now. And he said that in today's society, and social media doesn't help, smartphones don't help, we really don't take the time to know one another. And the example he used in the book, he said that he and his wife are often driving home from a party. They had a nice time. And as they talked to one another, they realized that at that party, they were in half a dozen conversations. They sat next to people. Nobody asked them anything. And saying, hey, how are you doing doesn't count for asking you anything. And Brooks made the point that we would be better as people, better as a society, if we took the time not just to say, hey, Jackson, how you doing? Great, and then move on, but ask questions that require more than a one-word answer. Jackson, tell me what's been the best part of your day. That's very different than how are you doing.
Yeah.
So that's the interpersonal intelligence. The intrapersonal is Tom Hoerr, and my school, the New City School where I worked, we thought that was the most important intelligence. That is knowing yourself. If
Mm.
you're strong intra personally, you know your strengths, you know your weaknesses. What that allows you to do is learn from your mistakes, and it allows you to put yourself in positions where your strengths are going to be really important and valued. The eighth intelligence, and then I'm going to stop and ask you for some thoughts and questions. Gardner came out with the first seven, and then probably 5 or 6 years later, he came up with the naturalist intelligence. And the naturalist is somebody whose strengths are working with animals, knowing plants, knowing
Mm-hmm.
the environment. So if you're someone who has a greenhouse, if you take care of pets, if you're a vet, if you're a farmer, you probably have a strong naturalist intelligence. And again, as I said earlier, no complex act is one intelligence.
Right.
If you're an artist, no matter whether you're a great painter, a great sculptor, you need to talk to other people. If you're a musician, unless you're playing alone in a closet, you need to talk with other people. So
Yeah.
that's the theory of multiple intelligences, and that's very much in contrast to the traditional notion, which is there's one intelligence. And
Right.
if you've got a lot of it, you're smart. And if you don't, well, I'm sorry. And
Yeah.
then last thing, and then we used the theory of MI at my school to give kids more ways to learn.
Mm. Yeah. Why did he decide to add that eighth one after the fact?
I'm not sure. When he came out with MI, and Howard is a friend, and we talked about this, everybody nominated intelligence. People would write him and say, Howard, I'm a great cook. What about the culinary intelligence?
Mm.
Somebody else would say, don't forget the humor intelligence and whatever. So he had a lot of those. He thought enough about the naturalist, but he took it through his criteria and he looked at it and came out and he announced that is the naturalist intelligence. Now, Tom Hoerr, and I'm not Howard Gardner, in no way am I, but I said, Howard, as I think about what you're describing, to me, it's a lot of logical mathematical, classifying, sorting, looking at plants, animals, snakes. But
Yeah.
nevertheless, those are his eight intelligences. Sometimes people today even will mistakenly say, oh, he's identified the existential intelligence as the ninth. He hasn't. He talks about the fact, writes about the fact that he ponders that, but at this point, we have the eight intelligences.
Yeah. Why is this a difference of degree or a difference of kind? If, like, per se, I really enjoy music, I really enjoy going to concerts and listening to other people play, but I can't play the piano. I don't know how to play any instruments or create music other than vocally, and my roommates wish I would stop doing that. So, is that a different kind of intelligence, or is it just a different degree of musical intelligence?
Tom Hoerr think it's just a different degree. It certainly is a musical intelligence. You know, you derive satisfaction from it. Daniel Goleman wrote a book in 1993, I think, called Emotional Intelligence, and that sold millions of copies, and that really changed the dialogue. And in his book, one of the comments that Goleman made was that if you have emotional intelligence, you know how to soothe yourself. That's exactly what you're talking about. So just from hearing that, I would say clearly you have musical intelligence. You can appreciate, as I talked about earlier, it's okay that you can't perform or create. You have a musical intelligence. Tom Hoerr, in contrast, rarely listen to music, so I don't even have that capacity. So, you know, there's a hierarchy, if you will, within each intelligence of proficiency.
Yeah. Are these things that you're born with, or are they grown, adapted as you grow up?
You know, the short answer is I don't know. There's a long debate we have about nature versus nurture, heredity. We don't know. Having said that, I'm old enough. I'm often struck, and when I was leading school, and now I'm really teaching at the university, and I have friends. I'm often struck by how often kids follow, perpetuate, if you will, in the footsteps of their parents. Um, I know a number of teachers whose children are teachers, a number of physicians whose kids are physicians, a number of policemen. I've got cousins whose dad was the policeman. I don't think that is a gene. I don't think there's a policeman gene. I
Right.
do think, though, that when you're strong in intelligence, you wind up creating an environment where your kid experiences a lot of that growing up. So if you are an artist, chances are when you've got a child, before that kid goes to school, she's probably gone to art museums. She's probably sat and watched you maybe painting art or creating a sculpture. Uh, she's heard you looking at art and talking about it. So that capacity that she has is nurtured. In my Tom Hoerr's mind, you know, we all have capacities in the eight intelligences. I talk about people's MI profile. So, you know, if I had eight little bars there, we all have some of each of the eight. Even I presumably have a little bit of the musical. But the profile changes on who we are and what our experiences are.
Hmm. For people who are trying to, they realize they have a lack of X intelligence. What's the right way to go about kind of bringing up your intelligence in a certain area?
Well, the first thing, I mean, to come back to your question and back up, presumably one has a strong enough intrapersonal
Personal, right? Yeah.
intelligence that he or she knows that. The converse of that, of course, is often people who don't have a strong intrapersonal don't know they don't have a strong interpersonal, kind of
Right.
redundantly, you know. If,
Yeah.
however, let's say, and I don't know you, but let's say that you thought, wow, you know, I really wish I had a stronger spatial intelligence. Like anything else, there's an old cartoon where a lady's walking in New York and she sees a policeman and she says, "Can you tell me how to get to Carnegie Hall?" And he said, "Sure, practice, practice, practice." And so that speaks to your point. If you want to improve in intelligence, you have to work at it. In our society, and I think this is my bias, I think it's unfortunate. In many, many, many homes, parents want their kids, force their kids, exhort their kids to do better in reading, writing, and mathematics. And I get that because they want them to be good students, and school is still pretty narrow. Tom Hoerr would say, though, that in addition to that, I'm not saying don't do that. I'm saying in addition to that, see what other intelligences your kids might have a proclivity in. Take them to the art museum, give them music lessons, take them roller skating. In my mind, the more experiences we can provide, the wider and richer experiences, the greater the likelihood that a child will find a talent that hadn't been uncovered and all of a sudden develop it. And again, I'm not trying to create professional roller skaters. What I'm trying to do is help kids succeed in life, not simply do well in school.
Yeah, but you do have the ability to um, exceed in one intelligence that you were once very bad at, to
Yeah,
get better at that.
yeah. My bias is you can improve in all of them. I mean, if I really wanted to be better in
Right.
musical, I would take the time and I would do it. That was my assumption as a school leader. That was true of all of the teachers in our school. You can always improve, you can always get better. And it requires intent and effort, but there's no ceiling if you really want to work on it.
Yeah. How are schools kind of affecting the intelligence growth and capabilities of students?
Well, I'm going to be, critical here, and I'm speaking generally.
Go ahead.
But again, most schools, again, are pretty narrow. When MI became popular, the book came out in 1983. The school that I ran was in St. Louis, still is, where I'm living now. And we implemented MI in 1988. By the year 2000, we had hundreds, and I'm not exaggerating, hundreds of educators visiting us every year from all around the world. There was a school in Iceland where they closed the school. The entire faculty came over for a week. I had parents put them up in houses, and they came and observed what we were doing. We again had hundreds and hundreds of educators visiting us every week. People understood then that what MI is, the theory of multiple intelligences, is a statement about potential. What
Mm.
it says is that we all have different smarts. Well, what happened, however, in 2001, Congress passed No Child Left Behind. And what that did was say, hey, nothing really matters except how well kids do on standardized tests. And if they don't do well enough, not only are they going to fail, teachers may lose jobs, schools may close. Well, the interest in MI in terms of visiting at our school dropped off dramatically. And Howard Gardner and I have talked about this. I heard from a number of educators who said, gosh, I embrace MI. The number of people, Jackson, who said to me, I wish I had been able to learn in an MI school. I would be a different adult today. It was amazing. When
Hmm.
teachers came and visited, the number of times they would say, I wish I had this, I wish my child had it. But after No Child Left Behind came in, that all went out the window. I have teachers who said to me, from Texas, California, Ohio, everywhere, I really believe in MI, but I cannot use it. My principal only wants me to do things which will tie to tests for achievement. Now, paragraph, that's naive. And the reason why I say that, at New City School, we enable kids, we encourage kids to use lots of different intelligences. And what that meant is that we were like any other school. We have some kids who were traditionally smart, high IQ kids. We have some who weren't. But because our curriculum allowed children to use lots of different intelligences in solving problems and learning, not every day, not all the time, not every lesson, but that meant that children succeeded. So, for example, in our fifth grade, 10 and 11-year-old students, we used to focus on the Civil War. I think most classes probably today did that, still do
Hmm.
that. Well, in most classes, however, you learn about the Civil War in a very traditional way. Kids read about the Civil War, they write about the Civil War. So guess what? The kids who are strong linguistically, Jackson, he does really well. He gets the Civil War. He's smart. Tom, I'm not a great reader. I didn't really get the Civil War. I got a C, I struggled. Well, over time, the message to Tom is that you're not very smart. School isn't for you. And subconsciously, often, kids stop trying.
Hmm.
I'm an adult. I don't want to jump in and do things where I know I'm going to fail. Kids do that too. So when we approached the Civil War unit theme, we said, how can we allow children to use other intelligences? So kids read, they wrote, that still happened, but there were times, for example, I visited classrooms where teachers would put kids in groups of three, and they'd get a big piece of butcher block paper, maybe, 4 feet wide and 3 feet tall, and the teacher gave them crayons. And what they had to do with that piece of paper was draw the history of the Civil War. Well, it was amazing. Inevitably, they would draw a horizontal line. Above it, these were the things in the north. Below it, these are the things in the south. They did it chronologically. So on the left, this is what happened. The Civil War started on the right, Gettysburg. And it was amazing to me. These kids did it. They got engaged. They could talk about the Civil War. They could stand up with their voter. What happened, though, is many, many more kids got really excited about the Civil War. They understood the Civil War and its causes than if they had simply written about it and simply read about it. So there was also a time in there when I went in and the teacher was trying to help the kids understand, how did this conflict happen? What did people believe? And again, you can read about that. Slavery was the cause. That's 3 paragraphs, and you move on. Well, what the teacher did, the kids talked about it, and then she put them in groups, and they had 3 by 5 cards. I think there were 4 kids in each group. One card was, you're a slave owner, you're a slave, you're a merchant, you're a Quaker. And the kids in small groups, and they had to develop a 4 or 5 minute little play based on what these people would have said, given what they believed in 1859, 1860. Wow. So the kids, again, they're demonstrating it, they're excited about it. The group of kids who succeed, who know, is much larger than if simply they read and they wrote. We did that kind of thing all the way through. Um, Fifth grade looked at colonial America. That was part of their history. And again, they read about it, they wrote about it. One of the favorite things that they did, though, is they went to the St. Louis Art Museum and they looked at art from the colonial era. What
Mm.
was being painted and who was there? And what can you infer from what's in the painting and who's not? Spatial intelligence. And then they came back and they talked about it. Well, the one thing that jumped out at them was, you go to the art museum, there's all kinds of portraits. Guess what? There's not a black in any portrait, although
Hmm.
there were lots of blacks. What's that message there? Kids get that. There were portraits of people who were born, lived, and died in Cincinnati, and they're painted in front of a Greek temple. Well, why was that done? What was the meaning? What you're doing is you're allowing kids to use other non-scholastic intelligences in learning and solving problems. I would argue that if schools had been allowed to do that, the test scores would have done better, because you wouldn't have kids by grade 3 or 4 thinking school isn't for me, not being motivated. You would have kids, as we did, coming to school because they knew it was going to be joyful, they were going to learn, and they could be smart.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of so a lot of people fail the SAT or any standardized test. I'm curious, do you think that's any of the problem of the test itself and the way it's set up, or is it mainly in the problem of how kids learn and how they're prepared for that standardized test?
Well, there's a reciprocity. I mean, the tests are designed to measure these particular intelligences, linguistic and logical, mathematical. And so that's what they do, and that plays into some kids and not some others.
Hmm.
And this isn't the topic for today's discussion, but since Frames of Mind came out, since a few years ago, we now have artificial intelligence on the table. And that raises the whole specter of, when you look at multiple intelligences, when you look at where we're preparing kids to work and what intelligences we want them to use, are we really preparing them for something that in 2 or 3 years they won't need to be doing? The state of Ohio, I know, is requiring that high schools and colleges require now kids to learn about artificial intelligence correctly, I think, because they know that when these kids leave school, it's going to be part of the real world. Now, artificial intelligence can do almost everything. You can go to AI and ask it to draw a picture and It'll do something that really looks good. Certainly it can do logical mathematics or it can write. The reality, however, is that it cannot yet, and I don't know whether it ever will, be able to do the personal intelligence really, really well. They have machinery, computers in emergency rooms, and when somebody comes in, they have machinery that is designed so that it isn't off-putting. It's not a IBM box, and that machine can not only say, "What is your problem?" and listen to you tell where the pain is, but it can also pick up your voice tone, to what degree are you feeling stressed, and so forth and so on. So the world is changing.
Hmm.
What I would argue, though, is that schools need to change, and one of the ways they need to do that is by respecting the fact that everybody has a range of intelligences, and when we talk about individualization, we not only need to recognize that some kids do math better than other kids, but that some kids have other intelligences that are stronger than other children.
Yeah. As far as the balance goes of when the teachers and schools are working on a curriculum that's going to be more beneficial to more kids, what's the balance there between making sure that you don't spend too much time customizing the curriculum so that nothing ever really gets done because you're doing so many different things for so many different types of intelligences?
Yeah, and I don't know specifically. What I can say is that our teachers recognize that even though we were an MI school, our kids still needed to do well enough on traditional learning to get into good schools and so forth. So they had a strong scholastic focus. Not every lesson had MI tied into it. Sometimes there would be lessons where everybody used the spatial. Other times, children were given an opportunity to pick which intelligence they wanted to use to solve a problem. And it comes back to kids knowing themselves and knowing how to use their intelligences in learning.
Yeah. And I think it's also good to like be around other people who don't have the same intelligence as
Absolutely.
you. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would argue, in fact, I've written a number of books. One I'm going to be doing a reprint shortly. I wrote a book in 2017, and in some ways it stems from my experience with MI. Excuse me. I, in fact, wrote a book called Becoming a Multiple Intelligence for School. And that was a guide for educators who wanted to move into MI and using it. And then a couple of teachers and I, with our faculty, wrote a book called Celebrating Multiple Intelligences and Succeeding with Multiple Intelligences, which contained lesson plans. In 2017, though, I wrote a book called The Formative Five. And what I did there is identify what I call success skills. And these are the skills, intrapersonal skills that kids need to succeed in the world. And I talked about empathy, self-control, integrity, embracing diversity, and grit. And the
Mm.
case I made in that book, and I'm going to be doing a revision shortly, is that we need to prepare kids to succeed in the world in life, not just to do well in school. And we look at what people who succeed in the world possess: empathy, self-control, integrity, embracing diversity, and grit. And that stems back, Jackson, from my work with multiple intelligence theory, because seeing how that worked in classrooms, seeing how kids who came in with different kinds of strengths, it really helped me develop an appreciation for the different intelligences, the different potentials kids have, and also the virtues they need, the success goals they need to move that forward. To come back to your question of 20 minutes ago, grit, if you want to develop an intelligence that you don't have as a strength now, you can do that. Guess what? It's going to require some grit because
Hmm.
it's not going to be easy. It's
Yep.
going to require some self control. And so, my argument then, stemming from MI, is that educators need to be preparing kids to succeed in the world, not just do well in school.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree with that. Why'd you choose those five for the formative five?
Well, it was interesting. I spent a lot of time reading. I did surveys. I would ask parents. My school had about 350 kids, and I would send parent letters every Friday. And every once in a while, I would say, "Do me a favor. Think of somebody who you know who's a success. Shoot me an email. Why are they a success? What qualities?" So it was interesting hearing all those kinds of information. As I said, I read a lot, but mostly I observed my kids. I had been at the school long enough. I was the head of school for 34 years, but I had kids who, when I came, were 12, and when I left, they were 46. So I could see what they had become as adults. I could see the qualities they had, and I could see what really nurtured them and moved them forward. In my book, in fact, I've got a chart where I have the 5 success goals, and then I have other terms for them. Integrity might be called courage. Grit might be called tenacity. And when you look at that chart and you see not just the 5 names, but 2 or 3 words for each one of them, it pretty much covers everything I think that we need to succeed. The
Yeah.
book that I'm thinking of doing now, haven't written it yet, but I'm considering adding curiosity to the formative 5. I
Hmm.
like the formative 5, but I think curiosity may be unique enough that there's merit in also talking about it as something that teachers and administrators should be cultivating in school.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree. I actually talked to Todd Cashdan about that a couple weeks ago, but he's of the same opinion that kind of curiosity is one of the big things that allows you to stay young and stay successful. It's one of the big things that all successful people have is a level of curiosity and
Yep.
humility that comes with that. So, as far as grit goes, it's interesting because at the moment the grit is becoming less necessary because you can do things like if it used to be I was talking to Roger Hall yesterday and he was like when I was in school I had to if I wanted to research a topic go to the library pick out the book figure out did I want to copy it because that would cost 25 cents so don't want to copy it necessarily get the things I want to get, and then come back home. Whereas opposed to now, you can kind of look it up on the internet, or even you can, you don't even have to write the paper anymore. You can use AI. How should schools go about developing grit in kids when it's very easy not to?
Well, that's a wonderful question, and your friend's example is right. I would argue, however, that it makes grit even more important.
Oh
When I
yeah.
talk with educators today, and this has been going on for, I guess 5 or 6 years, one of the things they almost always complain about is that today's kids don't have grit. I think some of that is due to technology and iPhones, because what happens, these kids spend lots of time playing games on their phone, and guess what? When you're losing, the easy thing to do is just start over. You don't learn how to hang in and be tenacious. And so I worry, as maybe your friend does, that the adults that are coming out of school today don't have that tenacity. They don't have that grit that we've talked about. So to me, if you want to develop grit, and we talked about that at my school, we consciously did that. You need to develop grit by candidly, and it sounds terrible, making sure the kids are put in positions where they fail or they're frustrated.
Hmm.
When we think about grit, initially people tend to think about kids need grit who aren't doing well, they can't give up. Well, that's true. Tom Hoerr would say, wait a minute, the high flyers need grit just as much. When I began talking about grit at New City School, we had a number of parents who were at the university, and I had people who were in the med school faculty, and they talked about how often every year they would get kids who came into med school or pre-med, and these kids had never gotten anything less than an A in their life. And all of a sudden they got a B and they collapsed
Yeah.
because they had never experienced that. So the case I made in my school, the New City School, was a preschool through grade 6 institution. And I said to my teachers, if a kid graduates from our school without ever having failed, without ever having been frustrated, we failed that child. Because this in our school is where she should learn grit. It's a safe setting. We can do it. We want that kid to hit the wall and get back up. Everybody's going to hit the wall at sometime. But if they haven't experienced it, if they don't know how to deal with it, it could be fatal.
Yeah. What do you think is the effect that social media is having on the growth of grit and also of the multiple different intelligences as kids are kind of forming their personality?
Well, I'm not a social media person, but maybe my explanation reinforces them. To me, social media has become a powerful tool for dividing us. I see this far less coalescing, far less forming groups of people who support one another. And I know that's there. I know there are some people who use it. But by and large, the divisiveness, the nasty comments, people who will write things and reinforce one another in a negative way that they wouldn't say in person. Um,
Yeah.
I read newspapers. I read the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal every day, and the articles are good. And sometimes, when I have a little spare time, I foolishly read the comments after the articles, and it is amazing to me. I'll read them, and there'll be two or three good comments, either pro, con, whatever, but logically well thought out. And then about every fourth or fifth comment, there's somebody who is doing nothing but making snide remarks and insults, and I think, where is this coming from? And of course, today it's even worse because we have a president who models that. He can't say anything about somebody without making a denigrating remark about them. And so the role model here is, oh yeah, if you don't like what people say, call them names. And again, social media reinforces that.
Yeah. Um, as I'm curious about the as how you're developing these schools. A lot of schools kind of struggle with developing guys in particular because guys are just less interested in school at a young age. Do you think that this multiple intelligences outlook could kind of help bring guys back interested into school?
I do. Before I elaborate, there was an article, it's interesting you raised this. There was an article, and I'm embarrassed. I'm old enough. I don't remember whether it was the Wall Street Journal or the Times, but one of them earlier this week had an article that there was a push to have boys start kindergarten a year later, because
Hmm.
young boys mature later. And of
Yes.
course, there was a pushback against that. Then they're later in life and da 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 da. But in any event, to your point, yeah, little boys often are less mature than little girls. And when you think about what is required, even in good schools, to learn how to read, write, and calculate, that often includes a lot of sit down, pay attention, be quiet, do what I say. And that's again harder for young boys than for young girls. Whereas, if during the course of the day, kids were given an opportunity to use their other intelligences, to use their bodily kinesthetic, to get up and move around and learn to draw, that would reduce the percentage of time, if you will, that they're in a situation that maybe is less comfortable. And I think you'd see the disparity between boys and girls trajectory decreasing.
Yeah. Um, what responsibility? What's how much of this is the parents' responsibility, and how much of this is the school's responsibility? Are you worried, concerned, thinking about that at all, or is it just kind of like how can we reform the schools?
Well, you envision a Venn diagram and the two circles almost overlap. I mean, parents are parents, they have the ultimate responsibility. Kids are awake more in schools than they are at home. I
Mm.
believe, though, that if you understand the theory of multiple intelligences, and if you recognize that what it really is a theory of human potential. It's really a way of saying we all have potential in various areas. Then I, Tom Hoerr, would say that it's up to both the home and the school to foster those various intelligences. And what you do, again, going back to half an hour ago, you expose kids to them. Um, if you have a child who rarely goes to the art museum, rarely goes to the symphony, they're not likely to develop that intelligence. Conversely, if you've got a kid who's always at sporting events, they're going to get bad. Um, this is hard for parents to do because by the time you have a child, chances are your intelligence profile is pretty well articulated.
Hmm.
You're stronger in these intelligences, you're less strong in those.
Right.
So, pick on you, Jackson, because you're here. If you're not strong in the spatial, it's probably less likely that you're going to take your kid to the art museum. It's probably less likely
Right.
that you're going to have a potter's wheel in the garage. And so it's only natural that kids kind of perpetuate the strongest intelligence of their parents. Schools work against that by design. In good schools, I shouldn't say good schools, in schools that are well funded, you're likely to have an art teacher, a music teacher, maybe a teacher of foreign language in schools that are not funded nearly as well in a school I went to. You didn't have that. If you had art, if you had music, it was done by a classroom teacher. It probably wasn't his or her strength. It probably skipped a whole lot. And again, now we've got test scores. So back in 1983, when Frames of Mind was written, I think it's fair to say that children's different potentials were far more recognized and able to be acted upon in school. Today, school has narrowed what we do by and large, and that makes it more imperative that parents will. But again, parents don't know about MI. They know what they do well, and they
Hmm.
assume their kids are going to do that too.
Yeah. Talk to me about these two different ideas that you've given out. One is on the one hand like grit and the ability for a kid to hit the wall and then bounce back, and then on the other hand, there's making the schools easier, more customized, more personalized, so that the kids hit the wall less often. Where do those two meet in the middle?
Well, good question. I think they meet in the sense that school needs to be conscious about grit. We need to talk about it. Parents need to know you're doing it. And no matter how much they love the school, kids doing well, if Johnny or Susie come home and they've been unhappy, that's a problem. I did a national broadcast on NPR on grit. I was interviewed a number of years ago. And a comment that I said is every parent wants their kid to have grit. No parent wants their kid to cry. And so what that means is, as educators, we need to say to parents, in addition to the 3 R's, let me tell you some of the other qualities we're going to develop in your children this year because they're success skills. I've been writing a whole lot about empathy, so I would talk about that. I would talk about grit, and I would do that hand in hand with them. In a small book I wrote called Fostering Grit, I talked about the fact that you can do this transparently. You talk about grit with your kids, regardless of how old they are, and then you say, okay, now have a good weekend because Monday is going to be grit day. When you come in on Monday, I'm going to make it extra hard, and I'm going to make it so that each one of you is unhappy and each one of you isn't succeeding, and that's okay because what I want to do is see how you respond. Now, kids know that it's not real, but I got to tell you, it won't take long when they're getting frustrated for that to go out the window and then to feel really frustrated. And
Yeah,
then you as a teacher can talk about how to respond.
right.
I had a performing arts teacher at New City, a wonderful teacher, Ben, and he got into grit by teaching with his kids by having him work on spinning plates. He had rods and plastic plates, and well, you might imagine nobody can do that well. And so he had a number of kids who were great musicians and sang well, and all of a sudden everybody was hitting the wall. And he said it was interesting how some kids, after 90 seconds, I'm ready to quit. This is no fun. Other kids, man, they were going to master it. And that's a
Yeah.
great learning opportunity for children to learn not to give up.
Yeah, and it is interesting that like a lot of the kids who don't do well in school, they learn that grit because they have to like make it out
Yep,
of school, and then that they take that grit with them to the rest of life, and turns out they're ahead of everyone else.
yep.
How do you make sure that you still breed that level of like determination in every kid, even though some kids are going to be generally more gifted at school?
Well, and of course, again, very quickly, the gifted kids need to learn grit just as much as the other kids.
Right.
I think it needs to be consciously and intentionally. And let me tell you a question I've raised because I think it speaks to this. When I do presentations and I go around the country and I talk about this stuff, when I do presentations on grit, one of the things is I'll talk about it, I'll explain it, and then I'll say to people, let me ask you, where did you learn your grit? And just think to yourself, did you learn it at home from your parents? Did you learn it at school? Did you learn it at work? Or did you learn it when you were mastering a sport or an athletic thing? Well, it's amazing, Jackson, how often that last one comes up.
Mm-hmm.
And what happens is if you're motivated, whether it's to be the cheerleader or the basketball player or to learn to play the violin, you often really develop grit in doing that, and
Yeah.
that transfers over. I have a friend who works with young children also, low income communities. And when she talks with her children or her students about grit, she'll point out the fact that many of her kids who are middle school age wind up caring for their younger siblings. Mom's working, dad's working. So they might be 9, 11 years old and they're doing breakfast for 2 or 3 kids. They're
Right.
taking care of them. And she says to me, we don't use this term, but that's grit. Those
Right.
kids were learning determination and grit there, even though it's not being formally taught.
Yeah. Yeah. And I do wonder, what is this? Is it, does it look different for guys and girls?
Yep, yep. And I think grit is something we can tie it into a macho kind of a thing, and guys get into that.
Yeah.
I would argue that's not the case, and hopefully it's less so than it used to be. And I'm thinking in particular, and this is a narrow slice, but I'm thinking about athletics. I mean, the women's NBA, women's sports return on ESPN. And it seems to me that the more girls are put into competitive athletics, that's good for girls, even if they're not on the team, because they see their peers being role models for doing the same kinds of things that
Mm.
boys are doing.
Yeah. How are you and your work with the multiple intelligence schools going about reforming this?
Well, there are not, unfortunately, that many multiple intelligence schools around in the United States. Indeed, there's more MI taking place in Asia and in Europe. Tonight at 8 o'clock Central Time, for example, there's a group in Hong Kong that has been working on MI for years. I've done presentations for them, and they've got a program that I'll pick up there. And again, these other schools aren't weighed down by the focus that we have on standardized tests. When you talk about how I'm working with them at the University of Missouri St. Louis, where I'm now teaching it, the classes that I teach are in the Ed Leadership program. So I'm typically teaching young people, younger than I am, that's everybody's a young person, young people who have a master's degree and are working on principal certification, or maybe they're working on getting their doctorate in leadership. And one of the things I talk about here is MI, but I also talk there very strongly about the formative 5 success skills, about culture. When I talk about leadership, and this speaks directly from the personal intelligences, all leadership is based on relationships. When you do something for somebody, you don't do it in this day and age. You don't do it because they've got the title of boss. If that's the case, you don't do it well, you don't do it often. You do things for people that matter because you believe in them and you trust them. You may not agree with them on this issue, but you know that they have your interests in heart. That's what good leadership is. That's a relationship that stems from empathy, that stems from interpersonal and intrapersonal intelligence.
Yeah. What can individual parents do, people who realize that they are lacking in different intelligences, individual teachers do to kind of try and spread this word around, bring up their students or their kids or themselves in this an ability to understand the multiple intelligences?
I think it's a kind of a 3-step process, and you just said understanding multiple intelligences. At a superficial level, all I want are parents to understand that kids have lots of different potentials. And you can email me, you can give them my email address, Jackson, after that I'm happy to respond to people, or they can Google it or Wikipedia or whatever. So if you're a parent recognizing that there are lots of different intelligences, then I think the second step is looking at you, the mom, the dad, the caregiver. What do you think your intelligence profile is? There are lots of tests that you can take to ascertain that in surveys. I would argue, and this is how we knew which intelligences were the strongest in our kids. I would argue the way to determine your strongest intelligence is by looking at how you spend your time. What do you do when you have options? That'll tell you what your strongest intelligences are. And then the third step, I think, like most of us, you probably spend a lot of your time operating in 2 or 3 intelligences. And I would argue that to really do justice to your child who's still growing, whether she's 3 or 13, make sure that she has experience, exposure to all the intelligences. So make a point of taking her to the art museum if you don't normally go there. Make a point of taking him to a musical performance, to a sporting event. So kids experience lots of different intelligences give them enough opportunity to do that. And part of it is maybe you doing it too. Maybe you're not bodily kinesthetic at all. Well, guess what? Take your kid bowling. That could be a great experience for everybody. And what it comes back down to is if you look at the theory of multiple intelligences, not as a theory about different intelligences, which it is, but as a theory about different human potential, which it also is, then I think that has implications for you, whether you're an educator or a parent.
Yeah, no, and I do think parents and teachers leading the charge in their own lives will encourage kids to do the same. So, where can people find you, all of this work online?
Well, so I've got a website, and I have all my articles, and you can email me there. The website is Thomas R. Hoerr, Thomasr, no, but penalty or dot in there. It's www. So if they go to my website, Thomas R. Hoerr, they will find all my information about my books. I've written 170 articles, or there's more stuff there than people want to read. Trust me. And if they've had a long day, they can read it and it'll help them go to sleep. But if they read that, they can get some information. They can email me. I don't have answers, but I'm happy to communicate with anybody and help them however I might.
Yeah, fantastic. I'll put all those links in the description. Tom, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thanks for taking the time.
Excellent. Thank you.
Appreciate it.